can you shoot slow shutter speeds on an iPhone? Well, the answer is yes, but no, but yes. And if that sounds confusing, stay tuned and I'll confuse you some more. iPhone cameras have progressed so much in the last decade or so, to the point where you can take some pretty stunning images. You can take RAW files, you can take 4K video. The cameras are amazing. But one of their Achilles heels is the ability to do long exposures or slow shutter speeds. Now, there are options, which I'll go into in a minute, but overall, you're actually quite handicapped by the ability to try and do long exposure shots with an iPhone. Now, your main option, obviously, is the default camera, which in itself is very, very limited. You can't individually control the shutter speed, and you can only get down to 1 second. And that is very, very limiting when you're trying to shoot long exposures in the daylight, trying to get ethereal looking water or clouds, that sort of thing. And that doesn't matter whether you're shooting RAW at 48 megapixels or if you're shooting HEIC. There is a caveat to this though, and this is where the first confusion comes in. In HEIC or indeed JPEG, you can shoot live photos. Now, live photos in post-production, either on the phone or on the Photos app on a Mac, can use a long exposure, a kind of faux long exposure look. By applying it, it will merge all the computational images that it took into a faux long exposure. Now, the same's kind of true if you're using some of the higher quality third-party apps, such as Lightroom Mobile or ProCamera. Neither of these will let the shutter go beyond 1 second, despite the fact that you can actually control the exposure, control the shutter speed manually. And I suspect that's Apple handicapping it so that you have to use live photos. I cannot understand quite why they won't allow shutter speeds of beyond 1 second, other than to control their own image quality. And perhaps by giving that option to third-party apps, they will feel that the image quality is not up to their standards and therefore they're limiting it. There is another option though, and there's a number of apps out there that allow you to use long shutter speeds beyond 1 second. I've downloaded one such app called Slow Shutter. But the question is it really opening that shutter or exposing that sensor for 30 seconds or 1 minute? Or is it really using computational photography, just like the default app, only using more images to create that compositional image? Today we're going to find out. But of course, in order to do that, we need some fast-moving water, some fast-moving clouds, something that's moving fast to give us that motion blur that we're looking for. And luckily, this being winter, this being the northeast of England, and it having snowed quite recently, right over there, as you may hear from my microphone, is the River Wear, the weir on the River Wear, and it's in full flood, giving us some really dramatic-looking water. And I'm going to shoot this camera with these different apps. I've got a ND filter on that will bring the exposure down as low as we need it to, because it's actually quite bright out. And we're going to see exactly what we can get from default app, from ProCamera, and from Slow Shutter app. Let's get into it and see what we can shoot. So I've got the ND filter on the camera. I've got the apps already set in the same folder so I can access them easily. I've got some incredible rushing water from the River Wear. It's been heavy rain over the last couple of days, so there's plenty of water, and the snow's melting on the high ground, so that's all rushing down. So we've got plenty of fast flowing water in order to get this ethereal looking slow shutter speed. Light is lovely, so let's get on with it. I'm going to shoot on the standard lens in all cases. That will give me a 48 megapixel if I'm using the default app, but it will still be 12 megapixels using the other apps. So let's give this a go. The first one I'm doing is HEIC with live mode on. So that will give us the live mode long exposure style image. So let's give that a go. So that's done. And now we'll switch over to RAW. And we'll tweak the ND filter down as low as it will go and see if we can get the exposure to drop as low as possible. Okay, Okay, that's that one done. Again, it's about a 1 second exposure, and as I said, that's pretty much the maximum exposure you can get on an iPhone using default camera apps and default third-party apps such as Lightroom Mobile or ProCamera. I'm going to go over to ProCamera now and see what we can get out of that as well. And that's 1 second there. The ISO is automatically set to 80. And let's give this a go with a 1 second exposure. So that's a few shots taken on ProCamera at 1 second. I'm now going to switch over to the slow shutter app and we'll see what we can get with that. Now, as I said, I'm not sure whether that's genuinely giving me long shutter speeds or whether it's using computational photography. So I'm going to switch over to that and we'll see what we can get out of it. And interestingly, because it's given me a blur strength, that strongly suggests to me that it is using computational photography rather than actually a genuine 30-second shutter speed. It could be that with the addition of the ND filter to genuinely slow down the shutter speed, we would get a better effect. So I'm actually going to do one in a minute where I've taken the ND filter off completely and we're just shooting with regular light. As you can see, it's quite a nice day today. We'll shoot with regular light and see how that comes out. So I'll take the ND filter off and we'll give it a go as well. See how that looks. And yes, it is giving me a 30-second exposure, which pretty much confirms this is computational photography and not a genuine 30-second exposure. I might have a look later for other apps that can genuinely give you a 30-second, 1 minute exposure, but I suspect they will not be available. If Apple don't let you go more than a second, I doubt that they will let third-party apps go more than a second. But we'll see, and when I get this back into Lightroom, I'll have a look and see if there are alternative apps, and we can discuss those then. So that's all the images shot. As I suspect, I do believe slow shutter is just using computational photography, because even with the ND whacked straight up, it was giving me an auto ISO and it just felt like it was taking multiple images and merging them in the app itself. I honestly haven't looked at the details of this app. There are a number of apps out there. I thought I'd just give the most popular one a try and we'll see what it comes out. So I'm going to go back. It's time for a cup of coffee. I'm going to go back to the studio, load these into Lightroom, and we'll have a look together in Lightroom just how good or indeed how bad these images look with these long exposures that we've used on this camera. Join me soon back in the studio. So welcome back to the studio. As you can see, I have the images in Lightroom, and we'll have a look at those in a moment, because what I also have are the negatives back from my late father's camera. And if you've seen the film a couple of weeks ago, I went out to the banks of the River Wear in Durham and I put a film through my late father's camera for the first time, possibly in 35 years. The negatives have come back from that. In that film, there was a bit of a plot twist. And in the next film, where I will have a look at those negatives, there is a further plot twist. So subscribe and look out for that one. Let's get into Lightroom and let's have a look at the slow shutter, long exposure images that I took on the iPhone yesterday. So I've color coded the images. The images in green were taken with the default camera app. The images in yellow were taken with the ProCamera app, and the image over here on the right in red was shot with the slow shutter app. And what I'm going to do first is have a look at the one that was taken on the default camera app in Apple ProRAW. And as you can see, there is absolutely no blurring of the water. It's not a long exposure at all. And the reason for that is every time I ramped up the neutral density, instead of bringing the shutter speed down, it actually took the ISO up. And I couldn't get the shutter speed down below 1/60th of a second. Now, I think that's just Apple trying to keep a shutter speed high enough so you don't get camera shake, and again, making the most of their image quality rather than you getting blurry images. If we come over to the live view, we do have an ethereal looking water. It's done a reasonable job. However, we have a very muddy looking print. It doesn't look great at all. If you come up here, you can see this looks like there's massive amounts of noise reduction that's been added to it, to the cathedral here. There's just a very muddy, very unimpressive looking image, considering it was shot from a tripod. This is a 1 second exposure. Obviously, it's taken multiple images to get that 1 second exposure and then merged them in a computational photography style. But it's not impressive. I certainly wouldn't be happy to say that that was a long exposure image. And the other thing I would also say is this water is flowing very, very fast. So that 1 second was probably enough with computational photography to get this ethereal looking water. If you've got slower water or slower moving clouds, for example, it's not going to look as impressive. Now, coming over to ProCamera, I could get the shutter speed down to 1 second. It's done a reasonable job of the image. It's not great, but as you can see, there is some motion in the water, there is some blur, but quite clearly, even with this major rushing water here, you don't get a great ethereal look to the water. It's not brilliant. It's also kind of washed out. It's actually quite hard to determine the exposure with the ND filters on. The iPhone doesn't do a particularly good job in very low light with ND filters blocking down that light levels. So not great. It's possible that you could stack several of these 1 second exposures and get a better image, but whether that's worth the effort or not, I don't know. Coming over to the slow shutter app, now that actually looks reasonably decent. It's a fairly good looking image. However, from what I've learned, slow shutter basically runs a 4K video clip as the exposure rather than shooting still images. And then it computationally works out those images and merges them back together as a long exposure image. So it's not really a long exposure slow shutter image. It's basically a video clip that's been merged multiple times, which of course is something you could do with the regular app if you had the time by simply taking multiple images at a relatively slow shutter speed, for example, in the live mode at 1 second, and then merging those together. It does do a decent job. The image is sharp, it looks all right. It's kind of a JPEG-y sort of HEIC feel to it. It's kind of over sharpened, but for social media, putting it up on Facebook or X or Threads or Instagram, probably nobody will see the difference. So in conclusion, I would say that none of the apps do a particularly great job. None of them are a substitute for a full-size camera and a proper long exposure, 30-second exposure. The closest, obviously, is the slow shutter app. That's a £2.99 download, so not hideously expensive, but you have to be aware that it is video computationally merged into a single image. Now, I think I could get the slow shutter app down to 1 minute. I shot those at 30 seconds, so it does work. If you're not particularly bothered about ultra high quality, if you're not going to hang it on your wall and you're just going to stick it on a Facebook or Twitter or something like that, then it works. For the default app, Live View, if you've got fast moving water or fast moving clouds, it kind of works. It's not great, but it kind of works. And 1 second using ProCamera, it really isn't long enough. So overall, I think Apple is really holding us back with this camera. I don't know why they don't allow us to go beyond that 1 second shutter speed. I'm sure there's no physical or software reason why we can't, but there may be some sort of quality issue with that they just don't want their images looking blurry by taken by people that don't quite understand what a long exposure is. So in conclusion, at a pinch, if you needed to get a long exposure, you've got a tripod or a mini tripod with you, probably the slow shutter app would be the best. But if you really care about the quality, then obviously you're going to need a bigger camera and a proper long exposure. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you've got any observations, comments, please drop them in the comments below, particularly if you know any apps that will actually allow you to take the shutter beyond 1 second. I'd love to hear about those. If you've enjoyed the video, give us a thumbs up. That would be absolutely brilliant. And if you've really enjoyed the video, subscription would be even better. And I will see you in the next one.